The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle by the time they left the cafe. It was the kind of early evening where the streetlights had just begun to flicker to life, each one casting a little halo in the damp air. The pavement shone like glass, reflecting the lights and the blurred motion of people rushing home. He walked beside her, hands in his pockets, his shoulder brushing hers every so often as they shared the narrow stretch of sidewalk. His man bun was a little looser than usual, damp strands escaping and curling at his neck. She noticed the way they clung there, framing his face in an almost cinematic way. "You've got rain in your hair," she said, smiling as she reached up without thinking. Her fingers brushed the back of his neck, where the tiny hairs met skin. Warmth and rainwater, an oddly intoxicating combination. He glanced sideways at her, his lips curving into that lopsided grin she'd come to recognize as both amused and faintly curious. "You always touch my hair," he teased. "Because it's always in my way," she replied, but the truth was more complicated. His hair fascinated her. It wasn't just the length, though it was longer than most men's, thick and a deep chestnut that caught red glints in the right light. It was the way it seemed to suit him. A part of his identity. She'd seen him tie it back with practiced ease, run his hands through it when he was thinking, let it fall loose when he was tired or had given up on the day. They crossed the street to her apartment building, the buzz of traffic and hiss of tires on wet asphalt fading as they stepped under the awning. She could smell him now, coffee, rain, and something faintly earthy that lingered on his clothes. She tilted her head, studying him as he pushed his damp hair back from his face. "You know," she began, feigning a casual tone, "I've never actually seen you without that bun." He raised an eyebrow. "It's not a bun all the time." "Prove it," she challenged, half laughing. For a moment, he just looked at her, weighing whether or not to play along. Then, with deliberate slowness, he pulled the tie free. The hair fell around his face and shoulders, heavier from the rain, and for a moment she thought he looked almost different, softer, somehow. "There," he said, mock serious. Satisfied, she grinned. "Not really. I think I'd have to see you with it, much shorter." That earned her a genuine laugh, low and warm. "And what, you'd cut it yourself?" "I could," she said, the idea tumbling out before she could stop it. It came out playful, but something in her chest thumped harder as the words lingered between them. He tilted his head, studying her expression. "Would you actually?" She shrugged, though her pulse quickened. "If you ask me to." There it was, a small shift in the air. Not dramatic, but undeniable. He didn't brush it off this time. Instead, he smiled in that slow, considering way that made her wonder if he'd file the moment away for later. The elevator ride-up was quiet, but not in a way that felt awkward. He stood close, hands in his pockets again, and she could hear the faint swish of his damp hair brushing against the collar of his shirt. She imagined running her fingers through it, imagined scissors sliding through those strands. The mental image startled her, half thrilling, half strange. Inside her apartment, the familiar warmth of the living room wrapped around them, the beige sofa with its folded blanket, the glow of the corner lamp, the faint scent of the vanilla candle she'd left burning earlier. He shrugged out of his jacket, draping it over the back of the sofa, and the lamplight caught the sheen of his still damp hair. She set their coffee cups on the table and flopped onto the sofa. "You could totally pull off short hair," she said, trying to sound as if it were an offhand comment. He sank into the armchair opposite her, stretching his legs out. "I used to have it short," he admitted. "Back before I let it grow out. But it's been, what, 3 years? That's a lot of history tied up in it," she mused. He gave a little shrug. "Yeah, I guess so." Then, a flicker of something more serious passed over his face. "It's funny though, sometimes I wonder if I'm keeping it long because it's part of who I am, or because I'm afraid of changing it." Her fingers curled loosely in her lap. She wanted to say that change wasn't something to be afraid of. That sometimes letting go was exactly what you needed. But instead, she leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "If you ever wanted to," she said softly, "I'd be honored to be the one holding the scissors." That earned her a quiet smile. He didn't answer, but he didn't dismiss the idea either. And that, she thought, was enough for now. Later that night, after he'd gone home, she found herself replaying the moment in the living room. The way he'd looked at her when she'd said she'd cut it. Not with disbelief or mockery, but with something more curious. She wondered if he was thinking about it too. The week passed in fragments, messages, calls, and 2 evenings spent together that had nothing to do with scissors but somehow circled back to the same thought. On Tuesday night, they went for a walk along the river. The air was cool enough to turn their breath into faint clouds, and the city lights shimmered across the water. He had his hands deep in the pockets of his coat, the bun sitting high and neat at the back of his head this time. She caught herself staring at it more than once. The way the light caught the curve of it. The way stray wisps framed the back of his neck. She could almost feel the weight of the scissors in her hand, the quiet snip, the heavy locks falling away. "You're doing it again," he said without looking at her. She blinked. "Doing what?" "Watching my hair like you're planning something." Her laugh puffed white in the air. Maybe I am. He shot her a sidelong glance, his lips twitching. You're relentless. By Thursday, the banter had started to carry a different tone. They'd ended up at her place after dinner, both curled on the sofa with a movie playing quietly in the background. He'd let his hair down without thinking, and it spilled over his shoulders in loose, natural waves. She shifted closer, her hand drifting almost unconsciously to the ends. You have no idea how much I want to see you without all this, she murmured. His eyes flickered to hers. And you have no idea how much I've been thinking about it since you brought it up. Her fingers paused mid-stroke. In a good way, he considered that for a moment. In a scary way, but maybe that's the same thing. She studied him, trying to read the quiet seriousness beneath his teasing. You're allowed to be scared, she said softly. Hair holds a lot more than people think. That night, he went home with his hair tied low at the nape, but she swore she saw something different in his expression when he left. Saturday arrived with a lazy grey sky, the kind that made the city feel smaller, quieter. They'd decided on a slow afternoon together, coffee, errands, maybe cooking dinner later. When he showed up at her door, she noticed immediately that his bun was looser, less deliberate, as if he hadn't bothered to tame it completely. You're early, she said, stepping aside to let him in. He set a small paper bag on her counter, brought cinnamon rolls. Thought we could start with sugar before anything else. They settled at the table, and for a while, the conversation drifted easily, work stories, music, the mild disaster of her last attempt at baking bread. But at some point, her gaze wandered again to the strands escaping at his temple. He caught her looking and set his coffee down. All right, he said, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Let's say I did let you cut it. Hypothetically, her pulse skipped. Okay, how short are we talking? She tilted her head, pretending to think, though the truth was she'd pictured a dozen versions. Depends. We could stop at something neat, still long enough to style, or we could go bold. He chuckled. Define bold. She leaned forward. Clippers. He made a face halfway between surprise and intrigue. That's not what I expected you to say. Too much, she asked, but her smile gave her away. He rubbed the back of his neck, eyes dropping to the table. Maybe, maybe not. Then, after a pause, the idea doesn't scare me as much as it did last week. By the time they moved to the living room, the conversation had shifted to other things, half-watched shows, a list of movies they'd both seen too many times. But the thought sat between them like a quiet third presence. Later, while he was leaning over the coffee table to grab the remote, she said it without looking at him, you'd look incredible with short hair. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low. Then I guess you should find out. It took her a second to register the words. She turned to him slowly, a grin spreading before she could stop it. You mean now? He shrugged, feigning nonchalance but unable to hide the flicker of nerves in his eyes. Why not? You've been threatening this all week. Her laugh was light but her hands had already started tingling with anticipation. I don't have a salon set up, she warned. That's fine, he said, settling back into the chair as if to make himself comfortable. I'm not here for professional. I'm here for you. And there it was again, that subtle shift, the air changing just enough to make her heart catch. The chair wasn't fancy, just one from her dining table, pulled into the middle of the living room so the light from the floor lamp fell across his shoulders. The rest of the room was dim, shadows pooling in the corners, the faint scent of cinnamon from the earlier rolls still hanging in the air. He sat with his elbows resting loosely on his knees, watching her move around the space like she was preparing a stage. She'd gathered the scissors from her bathroom, a comb from her dresser, and a small towel that she draped gently over his shoulders. You're still sure about this? She asked, standing behind him. His voice was steady, but his smile was wry. If I say no now, you're never going to let me forget it. That's true, she admitted, combing her fingers lightly through his bun. But you can still back out. He tipped his head back just enough to meet her eyes. I'm not going to. She loosened the tie and let his hair fall. It slid down over the towel, heavy and damp from the earlier drizzle, curling slightly at the ends. She ran the comb through it slowly, each pass making the strands shine in the lamplight. From this close, she could smell the faint trace of his shampoo, clean and subtle. The texture of his hair against her fingers was exactly as she'd imagined, thick, smooth, with a weight that made it settle around her hands. I'm going to start from the back, she murmured, mostly to herself. He gave a small nod. Do it. The first snip was quiet but deliberate. The blade slid through with a crisp, satisfying sound, and a thick lock of dark hair slipped past her fingers and fell onto the towel. His shoulders lifted just slightly, as if he were holding his breath. She watched the way the muscles in his neck moved under the skin, the way he tilted forward instinctively as she worked. More strands followed, long, heavy pieces that landed softly in his lap, on the floor, across his boots. Each cut seemed to make the air between them warmer, more focused. You all right? She asked after a few minutes. He exhaled slowly. It's strange. I thought I'd feel more I don't know. Sad. And you don't. He shook his head just enough to move the shorter hair at his neck. Not yet. Feels lighter already. She smiled, smoothing the newly cut section with her palm. That's the idea. She moved to his side, combing and trimming, letting the rhythm of the work settle over them both. The scissors whispered, the cut pieces made soft, almost inaudible thuds against the floor. Every so often, a lock would brush the back of her hand before falling, a fleeting reminder of what they were leaving behind. When she reached the front, she caught his reflection in the darkened TV screen, head tilted slightly down, eyes half-lidded, a faint smile ghosting across his mouth. You're enjoying this, she teased. Maybe a little, he admitted, opening his eyes to look at her. It's weirdly intimate. By the time she'd evened out the length all around, the towel was dusted with stray clippings and the floor was scattered with hair. His man bun, the one she'd teased him about for months, was now only a memory in the form of thick, dark strands coiled on the wooden floorboards. She stepped back to study him. The cut was neat, falling just above his jawline. It framed his face differently, drawing attention to the shape of his cheekbones, the line of his jaw. I could stop here, she said, watching him in the lamplight. He reached up, fingers brushing the ends. This is shorter than I've had it in years. You look good, she said softly. Yeah, but there was a pause, just long enough to suggest he wasn't entirely finished. His hand dropped back into his lap. What if we went shorter? Her brows lifted. How short? He hesitated, then glanced at the black clippers sitting quietly on the coffee table. I've been thinking about that too much not to try it. Her lips curved. You sure? He swallowed, eyes flicking to hers. Not completely, but I want to see. That was all the permission she needed. She set the scissors down and picked up the clippers, their weight solid in her hand. She could feel the hum even before she switched them on, that low, steady vibration that seemed to fill the quiet room. He closed his eyes for a moment as if bracing himself. When he opened them again, there was no turning back in his gaze. The clippers came alive with a low, steady buzz that seemed to fill the room. It wasn't loud, but it was deep, a sound you could feel in your chest. She stepped closer, the vibration running faintly up her arm through the handle. He sat still in the chair, head slightly bowed, eyes fixed on some distant point on the floor. You ready? She asked quietly. His lips twitched into a half smile. No, but do it anyway. She placed her hand lightly at the back of his head, fingers resting just below his crown. The warmth of his skin met the cool metal guard as she guided the clippers to the nape of his neck. The first pass was slow, deliberate. The buzz deepened as the teeth slid through his hair, leaving behind a clean, short path. A heavy lock broke free, tumbling down over the towel and into his lap. He inhaled sharply, not in shock, but in a physical reaction to the sensation. That's strange, he murmured. Good strange. He tilted his head slightly to give her better access. Feels lighter, colder, like air on skin I forgot I had. She worked methodically, each movement unhurried but certain. The clippers traced the curve of his skull, and more dark strands surrendered with each pass, landing in soft heaps around his boots. The sound was steady, hypnotic, a rhythm of trust and change. When she moved around to his side, he met her gaze briefly, a flicker of vulnerability there before he let his eyes close. She noticed the way his shoulders had dropped, the way he seemed to be letting go of tension with each fall of hair. By the time she reached his other side, the floor was littered with what had once been his defining feature. She paused for a moment, switching off the clippers. The sudden quiet was striking, the kind of silence that felt thick and full. She combed her fingers lightly over the newly clipped section, feeling the fine texture of the short hair against her skin. You've got a good shape to your head, she said softly. That made him laugh, eyes still closed. Glad to know my skull's been approved. She switched the clippers back on, lowering the guard for a closer cut at the nape. The vibration was sharper now, the sound a touch higher. As she guided it upward, she felt the shift in the air, cooler now that more skin was exposed. He shivered faintly, and she steadied him with a gentle touch on his shoulder. Almost there, she murmured. I'm not in a hurry, he replied, voice low. When she finished the final pass, she set the clippers down and stepped back. His hair was now short enough to show the lines of his neck, the angles of his face more defined. She'd left just enough length on top for a soft texture, but the sides and back were clean, precise. He reached up slowly, fingertips grazing the newly shorn hair. Wow, you like it? He turned in the chair to face her fully for the first time since they started. It feels like me, but also new. Does that make sense? She smiled, brushing a few stray clippings from his shoulder. Makes perfect sense. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he stood, closing the small space between them. Thank you, he said simply. She glanced at the floor, at the dark sea of hair surrounding the chair, then back at him. You trusted me with a lot tonight. Yeah, he said, his voice warm but steady. And I'd do it again. He reached up, taking her hand and guiding it to the back of his neck. The freshly buzzed skin was warm under her palm, the fine hair soft against her fingertips. How's it feel? He asked. She let her thumb trace a small circle there. Better than I imagined. They stood like that for a long moment, neither in a rush to move. The air between them was thicker now, not with hesitation but with something unspoken that didn't need naming. When he finally leaned down, the kiss was slow, deliberate, the kind that tasted faintly of cinnamon from earlier, warm and grounding. She felt the edge of his smile against her lips before he deepened it just enough to make her knees weaken. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. Guess I'll have to trust you with more than just my hair now. She smiled. I think we're past the trial run. Later, when he left, she watched him go with his hands shoved in his pockets, the streetlight catching the clean lines of his new cut. She knew she'd see him again soon, but tonight, the image of him in that chair, trusting her with each snip and buzz, would stay with her. And she suspected it would stay with him too.